All right, let's try to get started again. So I know I asked you guys not to write anything down, but I thought I would say how I would go about writing a paper for this class, and kind of try and do it at a level that's I think is appropriate for MA papers. So there's probably you guys are and I thought so the reason I'm doing this right is to sort of demystify the paper writing process in a way because it struck me that we're all sort of you guys especially you all especially are left to your own imagination in terms of what happens when you write a paper much of the time there sort of isn't a method, and this isn't one, but this is what the steps that I do. And what I mean by the MA level is that this is a paper that I could write, and maybe someday I will because I kind of like it. I like what's involved in it, and it adds something to the literature about Lang, or it would if I read it, that doesn't exist, right? Because I know that literature, so I can tell. What I mean by the MA level is that this project wouldn't require you to do a lot of work in an archive or to discover new things about Fritz, new historical things about Fritz Lang that nobody has ever known before by somehow, interviewing people or again, working in an archive or whatever. But this is just based on known things about Fritz Lang. And the way it contributes to the Lang literature is by applying a different theoretical matrix to the films, and specifically a materialist one, and if you want a materialist feminist one, and one that's grounded in Marx, but specifically looks at the depiction of circulation in Marx, and the way we were looking at the film's depiction of circulation, looking at the film as a horizontal map of circulation, and looking at Metropolis as a vertical map of production on Tuesday, right? So this is got to do with that. So I would say that the definition of papers for MAs that are good are hopefully drafts of something publishable or something publishable, and that doesn't require extensive archival research that would have to be funded. Is why it's easier to get funded for a dissertation project to go to an archive, and we don't have much of one here in Athens. So that's one limit, and the other limit is that at the MA level, I'm not fond of the word that master, right? You're going to be masters of art, but the idea is to show competence in a field, right? Whatever a field is. But to show some kind of competence and to generate new stuff out of that competence. So this paper doesn't, and nor should you feel obliged at this point, or feel bad if you're not inventing a whole new set of problems to address, right? Or not, but recognizing problems that have hitherto been unrecognized. That's something that I would demand of you if you were all doctoral candidates, and those of you who go on, I hope that people who are responsible for you, for that part of your education, demand that of you, because that's what it should be. But you can get very creative without defining an entirely new area of questions, right? So for a dissertation, because I know a lot of you are going to go on, for a doctoral dissertation, I think the idea is really either to really discover things in archives that change the way something is looked at or that wasn't looked at before on the one hand, or to find some brand new problems that have never been delineated before, or optimally both, because they're connected, and you can't really do one without the other. But this isn't quite that. So I started where I always start. And this is why I've been asking you about how you came to your set of problems with a problem set, right? So these are this paper comes out not of some kind of pre-existent interest in Fritz Lang, And you have this, by the way. You have the link, right? I sent it to you. So it's not that I go around worrying about Fritz Lang a lot. Although maybe I should, right? I'd be a proper film scholar if I were. What's up with Fritz Lang? But no, as it happens, not so much the case. So as we've seen from hearing you guys tell me where your problems come from, they come from one of two kinds of places. And some problems come from sort of being interested in a field of study and asking the questions that about the objects in the field of study that are just kind of about that. So for example, what do certain films get out of setting themselves in Stockholm? And those can be great and interesting questions. And as it happens, I'm not very good at asking them, right? Because I have trouble. I can ask them, and I can recognize them and recognize what's productive about it. But I have trouble pursuing them and articulating them because I have other problems, right? I never know how to sort of be in the world, basically. And so the way I figure it out is by doing this kind of work with you and other people, and talking to people about movies. But really, you're wondering, in the case of movies, how movies, say, ever get made, given the problems of being in the world, or how they figure or depict certain problems. And it's quite striking that problems that are problems in my life are often depicted in films, or films have something to do with them, right? And so these problems come up in other cultural practices and other forms of art as well. And one hangs about universities long enough to be an MA candidate at Ohio University, even before you're as old as I am. And you meet people, and they also are interested in both types of problems, right? And so you chit-chat with them, or I chit-chat with them. And often I learn more about the problems, and the problem becomes very present and demanding, right? Like you really have to solve it because you're working on it by talking about it. And what the problem is becomes defined. You start reading other things and stuff. So I have been having conversations about the basic problem set here with Jaleh Mansour, who's a professor of art history in British Columbia, the University of British Columbia. And it turns out that this things related to the problem of capitalism and women and markets and the production of gender is something that in art history, particularly art history of painting, French painting from the late 19th century, those problems are alive in the literature. Right? They come up, is all I mean, in the literature. So in order to kind of show you what this problem is, I included sort of the source, and so a lot of kind of the approach to Lang and so on comes directly out of stuff that I've been talking about with Jaleh, and also in some way more distantly from this kind of art historical background that I don't know very well, but just so that you can understand what it is that what the problems are. I've decided to introduce it because you can see it in this painting, or you can see that other people have seen it in this painting that I'm in. So this is a famous painting, and it's the bar at the Folies Bergère by Manet, and you can see it's from 1882, so late 19th century. And T.J. Clark and Carol Armstrong, two well-known and widely published art historians, have written about it. And Clark writes that the barkeep in the painting is both a salesperson and a commodity, something to be purchased along with the drink. Right. So the question of what it is to be her, or what her structural position is, in the economy is vexing, right? Because this woman, this person, has to sell things and is herself for sale, right? Which is a striking position, right? To be in. And other people think that Manet puts oranges near prostitutes on a lot of canvases that he paints. So that's another sign that other artists notice, right? And Carol Armstrong points out that the barmaid appears before us as more as a commodity, similar in shape, and objective appears to the bottle on the counter than as a consumer. So she could be, that's the other possibility on the market. She could be a consumer. She could be a seller. She could be a commodity, and she's at least 2 out of 3 in this painting. There are various ways of thinking about this position that suggests that gender itself and what counts as proper enacting of gender, where the divisions are, what it is to have an acceptable kind of femininity, an acceptable kind of masculinity even, and so on, are related to this problem of how women do, how they, is it survivable to be in this position with regard to markets, right? There's something there that's worth looking at in texts that articulate, that represent, that depict someone in that position. And so I just had that in my head, right? I was like, what is that? Because we have to, it's something we live, I think, all the time. So then I was away last week, but nonetheless, I watched the movies. And I was immediately struck by this image. Like, for first time I rewatched M. I was immediately struck by the image on the right, on the left of this pair. The girl who's a potential victim. She gets away with her mom later in the scene, but she's a potential victim of Beckert here. And I just put them up as a pair, not so much for a comparison purpose, but you can just to acknowledge it's a fairly standard point of view structure, right? His eye line matches the mirror, and it's not quite the sort of glance shot where you see the character's eyes, but it's within the parameters of a paired point of view shot. So one thing that typically gets noticed about this is that he's looking at commodities. Right? People say that, and there's something about modernity usually back there, right? And that a lot of things. Another thing that's noticed is, which isn't too important for me at this stage of research, is that the girl emerges from off-screen space. And a lot of stuff in M, a lot of important narrative elements emerge from off-screen space or remain off-screen. So Beckert himself is introduced through a shadow on the kiosk, right on the poster that says murder, and so on. And so he's associated with commodities by this reflection, by looking at this window and other windows in the movies. And then what people notice less rarely is that so is she, right? So is this little girl, because she, at least from his point of view, is positioned like one of the commodities, right? She's reflected on the mirror in the window, and it's just something. I saw it, just a formal thing that I saw. Just, she comes in from off-screen space and is in this point of view structure and reflected in the window. But if the Bar de Folie Bergère can be said so easily to position the barmaid as a prostitute and as both seller and object for sale, surely we can say that the film is positioning this little girl as a kind of commodity and putting her on a market, right? And so there's something there, perhaps, and I believe this is overly optimistic, about Fritz Lang. Perhaps it's something, and it wouldn't be that optimistic because the argument would be limited, but perhaps um, this is a way of saying that putting a, a, a girl or a woman, female, into the position of the commodity is necessarily lethal, right? But something. I mean, that wouldn't be my thesis, but something like that is floating around somewhere around that image, right? So then, having noticed that, I thought, well, that's pretty interesting, and it relates to this set of problems that really are important to me in a lot of ways. So, what was the next thing to do? The next thing to do would be for me, was to say, well, I have this sense that this, in one way or another, happens a lot in the film. So let's see if that's true. So how do I see if I'm right about something in a movie? What I essentially do is watch it several times, right? I do it in a particular way that's really productive for me. You may have noticed that I like to take pictures not only of you, but I like to take pictures while I'm watching movies in here. I take pictures while I'm watching movies at home on my TV. I take them at in the movie theater. And then I also like to play, and so I make these stills, right? Not these. But it's just a way of keeping track of certain things in movies. And then I like to play the movie through VLC, which has a really easy still function, and extract. And not so much because the stills are nicer. Sure, if I put up a thing to help you with your assignment on the web, it's nice to have stills that aren't at canted angles and where the contrast is something like the original contrast and so on. But just because it slows me down watching the movie, right? And I can really try and look at things in a particular kind of way. And so if you're curious, I don't know how to do it with Blu-rays, which I have to figure out, but I use Handbrake, which is free. This is on a Mac. I don't know how to do it on a PC, but I use a program called Handbrake, which converts the movie into an MP4 from a DVD, and then just run it on VLC and take out the stuff. So I needed some supporting, what I call supporting observations. And supporting observations should do two things, right? It should allow. They should not only support the original observation, but they should also somehow allow for the elaboration of the thesis, like let it grow, let the thesis, or not the thesis, but the kind of speculation, the things that you're speculating about, should be able to grow, right? So M frequently shows Beckert buying commodities. And the interesting thing about these scenes is not only are they there, but they're not highly motivated by the narrative. In other words, as Bordwell and Thompson would say, the cause and effect connections between these scenes and other scenes are pretty loose, right? So you could say that this scene where Beckert is buying fruit is connected to the rest of the movie because he gives the last little girl that he tries to murder an orange, right? And he's about to peel the orange with the knife, and then the guy comes and puts the M on his back, and she gives him back the knife, so on. There's this thing from Chekhov: if there's a gun in Act 1, it should go off by Act 3. This isn't exactly at a gun going off level of narrative connectedness, and it doesn't really resolve major narrative enigmas. And one of the things it does is it kind of slows things down, and it shows you part of Berlin, right? It creates an atmosphere, but it also slows things down to kind of, and one might say that it plays an important narrative function in heightening the suspense in the film. But if that's its function, it could be a scene of Beckert doing anything incidental, right? But it's a scene of him buying something, right? And it's not just a scene. People often say of this scene that there's something about consumption and Beckert, right? So Beckert is shown consuming things a lot, the way he consumes a little bit. But I would say it's more than that, because the film shows you the actual exchange of money, right? That he buys these. You have to see the act of buying for some reason. So that's pretty good. And then there's also this scene where he goes to a cafe, right? And he has the two brandies, and he gets charged $165 for the two brandies. Again, similar kind of thing, right? Not very motivated, right? There's a little bit of characterization. We learn. I mean, you of course have to acknowledge that at the level of denotation as opposed to connotation in the narrative, we're learning that he's conflicted about murdering these little girls, right? He's. I mean, it doesn't make that explicit, but throughout the scene, he's nervous. He's shown through this trellis here as if he's hiding and ashamed, and he's clearly having the liquor as a form of anesthesia. And then, even perhaps most convincingly, is the conjunction of this narratively significant moment and this motif of associating Becker with spaces of economic circulation, with commercial spaces, with spaces where there are commodities for sale. You can't tell from this shot, but this is the scene right when he drops the knife and the orange that he's going to peel for the little girl. And they're standing in front of a shop, and it's very clear that they are. And she says, "You have something on your back." And he says, "What?" And he looks. And so this is a reflection in a shop window when he finds the M, right? And the movie takes its turn to the active pursuit. So all of those support one feature of the stuff that I'm wondering about, which is the connection between Beckert and economic circulation, and secondarily Beckert and consumption. That's really in the movie. So now I'm thinking, oh, this is worth doing. Right? And so, second, and this is just one shot, the market there's a Marxist notion of the universal market. And one of the things the universal market can mean is that at a certain point in capitalist development, everything is for sale. Right? And this is largely an urban phenomenon in many ways. It's, as we saw in cities, in Zimmel, as we read in Zimmel, time becomes very important in cities because people have to keep working, right? They have to keep being engaged in commercial transactions. So that means that especially in urban life, all the kinds of kinds of care that people would provide for each other in other ways, for example, through family mechanisms, can instead, and often are instead, bought. So in pre-capitalist rural life, and even in pre-capitalist rural life, there wasn't a whole lot of demand for childcare because of the way gender systems work, right? Where it would be sort of somebody's, or the job of several people to do that, paid for childcare. That kind of service emerges at a certain point of capitalist development in urban areas, right? And it's a new kind of thing you can buy. The processed food is another example. Processed food emerges, ready-to-eat food emerges in a situation where people are too busy working to have anybody cook, for example, right? That kind of thing. So the market's sort of everywhere. And in M, the market is invasive, right? And one of the things, so Keyes reads this nicely as an example, as a figure for the film's seriality. Right, so there are various serial procedures that he names in the film, and this guy is selling a serial detective story, right? This traveling salesman. He reads it that way, but it's also he's a figure for one of no doubt many salesmen who come to people's houses, even in the slums, to sell them something, and thus turn this space, which is a private domestic space, into, at least temporarily, a market space. right? And it's fairly benign. The relationship between them are friendly, but still, it's the home as we see it. It's this space of domestic labor for Elsie's mom, and it's this space of kind of mournful absence in the shots of Elsie's plate and so on, when where she's not there. But it's a more or less private space, and it's more or less not highly commercialized until this moment. Right? He comes in and suddenly he's selling something. That also so that allows for both as that functions as both support and the possibility of elaboration. And then this last set just shows that the victims are also associated with Marcus consistently during the film, because for one thing, because Becker buys all of his victims and possible victims something, right? If he can get that far, he always buys something. So he buys Elsie the balloon. It then becomes this sort of weird that does all this work. But nonetheless, he doesn't have the balloon with him, right? He could have the balloon with him, hoping to attract Elsie by having the balloon. But the way that the film narrates is, it shows us the actual act of purchase, and thus brings both of them into the space of economic circulation. This girl, he takes her to the candy store. He could, be shown as having the candy with him, using the candy to seduce the girl, and so on. But he actually takes her to the shop, and then they go and look at a toy store, and we see them looking at the toy store from inside the shop, right? Again, associating the girls with commercial space. This shot, another shot of little girls in front of the shop, and this is the one who gets away from the first shot. And you remember she passes a bookshop, right, with this insane show window with the arrow that goes up and down, supposedly ostensibly to draw attention to that book. But really, it draws attention to her in a very aggressive fashion. A few frames before this, when she walks by, spinning hypnotic wheel that also again ends up in Marcel Duchamp's and Munich cinemas. And then furthermore, so you have to think about what kind of women and little girls there are in this movie besides little girls. So what kind of women we have in this movie. And there's one shop girl that I found that we see clearly, who's the exception to this. But all the other women that we see are marked as either mothers, right? So these are the mothers from the beginning. But we also see, various kind of extras as mothers, right? So the women, the fancy dressed women waiting outside the school, and the mother of the little girl who gets away, and so on. They're by far the most prominent, the most numerous class of women in the movie, category of women in the movie. And then we get a fair number of prostitutes. So we get this streetwalker, maybe, well, it's not worth turning down the lights for, but this wasn't perhaps the best frame. She turns, and you can see she's dressed in a short skirt and heels with striped hosiery. She's walking on a street alone. And then the various women with boas, for example, in the bar gambling club that gets raided, and also in the trial, some of whom are the same from the other location. So then you have all this stuff, but then what I like to do, and I find this really helpful, is to ask some preliminary questions about the interest and the observation in hopes of being able to find a thesis or find something that will eventually lead to a thesis. And all of these questions get worked on and then thrown out on the way to, when I do this, on the way to a thesis, right? So I ask a set of preliminary questions. Often they're historically grounded comparisons between texts, not texts. And I find that useful, right? Just as a way of thinking about this stuff, whether I use the other texts or not. The interest in observations above define basically a field of research, right? The problem set and so on. So a research project has to eventually result in a thesis when in its final expression. So a clear claim about the material is one way of thinking about a thesis. One way to arrive at a thesis statement in a paper is to ask questions about the research area, as I said. And so these questions don't necessarily, in fact, probably don't at all belong in the paper, right? It's just a way of getting to, for me to get to whatever the paper would be. So one thing to notice is that in Berlin, Symphony of a Metropolis, we also have a film that associates women and figures for women, not men, sorry, for figures of women with markets. But in M, that association has turned murder. So what accounts for that change? There are at least two obvious things. One is that Berlin Symphony of a City is shot and largely edited before the crisis hits, right? It comes out in 27. And so maybe the murderous character of M is due to the fact that consumption and thus the relation of women to markets is even more vast after the crisis. That's one thing that you might wonder about. The other obvious thing is that by 1931, Germany is, Nazis have been elected, and it's not the shift between a state capitalist economy and which is to say a fascist economy and the capitalist economy of Weimar hasn't quite happened yet in 31, but nonetheless, perhaps the rise of fascism is a failure. So, here are these mannequins who are in the window, and these are just figures of women and not actual women, but this kind of association of a market with femininity, with an image of woman is strong, and even little girl mannequins, right? In this window. Another one. These are just two of many in the film. And then we have our pal, the flaneur, right? He's cruising, right? He's trying to pick up ladies, and in some way, and they're in a shopping district. And in some ways, there's a commodity relation going on through here. And that's clearer through a still that I forgot to take, but you'll remember it, which is, or a scene that I forgot to take stills of, but you'll remember it, which is the scene in which this flaneur and a different woman are looking through two windows at an angle to each other on a shop on the corner of a building, and they're both, at least he's pretending to look at this stuff, and she either is looking at this stuff or pretending to as well. And then he races to the other side to try to hit on, right? So that would be an even clearer example, right? So second question, different question, but also important for me, I think, to consider, is that Beckett kills little girls who never grow up to be mothers or prostitutes, the two options that the film gives to women. So in so doing, he kind of kills the possibility of social reproduction, right, or biological reproduction too. And by even before, it's not just killing mothers; it's killing anyone. It's like, as if killing the very possibility of reproducing the human race through femicide. Right? And it's important that it's through femicide. How does it? So Lang has an explicit interest in this in the Metropolis, right? In the movie that we saw before, which is explicitly about, in part, about about social reproduction and what it costs a particular mother, and perhaps that's generalizable. So here's the beginning of the scene where the boss of the city comes to visit the scientist in the middle of Metropolis, as the title says. So we were right, because one of the things I remembered when I pulled the stills was that the film quite explicitly locates that house in the middle, right where we put it on our map. But anyway, so he reads this, he sees this monument to hell, and he reads the inscription, and it says, "Born from my happiness and mankind's blessing, lost to John Feddersen, the boss, died giving birth to Freder, John Freddersen's son." So the scientist's wife, the petty bourgeois woman, has an affair with the boss and then dies in childbirth for his son, right? So this is another, not a murder, but it's another death of a mother, a potential mother, right? In this time, the reproduction is successful, but it costs her her life. Right? For me, she is not dead, John Freddersen. For me, she lives. Do you think losing a hand is too high a price to pay for recreating hell? Do you want to see her? And then she's the robot who will be reconfigured as Maria, eventually. So this robot, a form of dead labor, as we discussed, comes to originally to be Hell, this dead mother-wife person, right? So that, to me, is enough to say, at least in this period of the late 20s and early 30s, the last German period of Lang, but it would be worth looking at other Lang movies, perhaps. And it would be, and by extension, perhaps all of Weimar culture, that there's this problem of human reproduction, of biological reproduction, social reproduction, and of women who die either to prevent human reproduction, seemingly, or in the course of human reproduction. It's something that comes up twice and once in this super explicit, pronounced way, right? It's the motivation for the making of this robot, and this is very different from the way in which in M, the murder of the little girls are part of the narrative substance of the film, right? And a very important part of the cause and effect chain. But it's not as explicit. The issues of reproduction aren't quite as explicit. Here, you not only get a moment of huge narrative importance, where this robot comes from, the motivation for the making of the robot, who's going to be a central part of the narrative, is explicitly tied to this death, not only of a woman, but death of a mother, and in the act of reproduction itself. It's kind of big. And so that gives you another way, not only to support the questions, right, to support the initial observation, but it gives you a way, it gives me a way of elaborating, right? Elaborating it throughout Lang's career, opening it up to Weimar culture, doing a bunch of stuff. So to what extent, third question, does M articulate the dependency of capitalist social reproduction on the sexual and domestic subjugation of women? To what extent does the film's focus on girls and mothers displace the problem of the prostitute, who's most clearly a salesperson and commodity? So one could ask, what's happening with the prostitutes who we only see in ways that mark we just sort of note that the camera just sort of notes their existence, but nothing much happens to them. So it would be possible to think about what kinds of things are missing, right? What kinds of things are obviously lurking behind that you're noting. And then to what extent does Lang's film merely repeat the percepts involved, or merely deploy the percepts involved in subjugation of women? So that is that all of these questions are basically: is Lang's film is M critical? Does it have a critical side to it? Is it mostly critical, or is it mostly participating, or is it kind of just noting this? And there's a certain way in which certain things that Lang likes to repeat, like that we might all be in a position like Beckert, which is usually taken as we could all be victims of the Nazis because of the way the allegory of the mobs work, and he's, as you guys noted, the victim of a mob, but could be asked otherwise, right? Could that notion that we're all sort of like Beckert, could that be a way of saying that there's what a market needs to function, and what men need to function? It's this kind of capitalist femicide, basically, and so it just, that might be Lang's participating in it. There were also these rumors that Lang used to kind of keep alive himself, that before he ends up with Thea von Harbou, his wife dies, and that there were questions, which apparently had not much legitimacy to them, about whether he had been involved in his first wife's death. So there's a lot to wonder about Lang and femicide. But then the next step is to find out about not only find out more about these films by reading various examples of criticism and theoretical writings and historical writings about the films, but just to kind of read about women in this period in Germany, read some stuff about capitalism and social reproduction, capitalism and circulation, learn the difference between the spheres of production, circulation, and reproduction, and that kind of stuff. So I produced a big bibliography with minimal annotations. And so the first thing after producing this bibliography that I would do is read all the material carefully and extend the annotations until the annotations become reading notes. And I won't read the annotations, but or maybe I'll just say something brief. They're brief in any case. So an article the entire collection, When Biology Became Destiny, Women in Weimar and Nazi Germany. It has a lot of interesting chapters, articles, and a lot of economically based stuff. And so the one I focused on two. You can read about that. Later. Also, there's a fairly recent 2006 book called Social Reproduction, Feminist Political Economy Challenges Neoliberalism. Some of the ways in which reproduction, social reproduction, is conceptualized in that book are useful. And then When Biology Became Destiny, an article called Kinderkirche, Women in Weimar Politics, was quite useful to me. So various articles about women in that period in Germany. You can read them all later. Various articles about Baudelaire, like the Christine Bucki-Glucksmann article about catastrophic utopia. So that's an article about the feminine as an allegory of the modern, as you can see from its subtitle. It's somewhat useful to help engage this particular problem set with the rhetoric of modernity that's all over the writing about Lang. And then, this article on the notion of a crisis of social reproduction is really useful and has a lot of really useful citations from Marx and others conceptualizing social reproduction in a precise way. Mary Rosa Della Costa and Selma James, sort of diptych or two essays published together, essay and a pamphlet, Power of Women and the Subversion of the Community, is extremely useful kind of introduction to materialist feminism and some of the issues here. From Berlin to Bunker Hill, which is mostly about a remake of M, shot in Los Angeles. Losi's remake from wide angle is somewhat useful, also around the question of modernity. Then various articles like the Liplow and Draper article specifically about organized feminism in this period in Germany, I found useful. Feminism and Female Emancipation by Richard Evans is about the same topic, but mostly about the historiography of that topic and about the kind of challenges that face historians. It both has a compendium of sources, because it points to particular problems in particular historical sources, and also is helpful for conceptualization. Sylvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch is a really important book for understanding women's unpaid labor as primitive accumulation, as part and parcel of capitalist development and its relationship to colonization, and the origins and structures of contemporary misogyny, but also for the history of the relationship of women and markets. Mark Farrow's Cinema and History has a short, slightly vague, but useful chapter, suggestive chapter on M as an allegory for Nazism. Maya Andrea Gonzalez's Communization and the Abolition of Gender is kind of the standard or best account of the relationship between women and markets around. So that's on the bibliography because it's really important to the concepts that I'll be working with. An article about abortion in this time, which seems likely to provoke some kind of thinking, given that the children are, little girls are killed, and so on. More women's history. In Weimar, Tom Gunning's very long, the films of Fritz Lang, probably only the introduction, the chapter on M, maybe the chapter on Metropolis will be useful to me, but I had to look at it because it's the most recent major work. And then Andreas Huyssen's Mass Culture as Woman, which is another sort of consideration of the feminine or woman as allegory for modernity, but in the mass cultural register, the popular cultural register, and then an article by the same author about the robot, but about the robot in terms of the real Maria in Metropolis, Alice Jardine's Dionysus Configurations of Women and Modernity. There's a lot of material about women and modernity, which is going to be probably for this project a side issue, but nonetheless important for me to deal with. The Kay's book we read, an earlier article on mass mobilization that basically is an extended version of the chapter on mass mobilization with a lot more about Ernst Junger in it. And then the Weimar Republic source book, which Kay's is one of the principal authors for, which is an extremely useful collection of all kinds of facts about Weimar and Weimar Berlin. And E.N. Kaplan has a great bibliography of Lang that's in the library, so I included that. It doesn't go beyond 1981 when she wrote it, but for the literature on Lang before 1981, it's very useful. Caligari to Hitler, a book
I believe you're mostly familiar with, a standard source on M. The Monsters of Weimar is a set of fictionalizations of real crimes from Weimar, Germany. And it has a fictional account of the Fritz Haarmann case. Fritz Haarmann was the serial killer in Dusseldorf that is based on Capital Volume 1 by Marx, many useful passages on economic production, circulation, and the difference between the two. In my case, I reread it recently, so I don't have to necessarily reread the whole thing, but it'll be in play, and so on. The only other one that I'll name is Klaus Tegelite's Male Fantasies, which is a 2-volume, more or less Deleuzian study of kind of male fantasies and the psychology of masculinity in the period. A standard work in thinking about masculinity, really interesting, and brings up a lot of the issues, but sort of from the other side accounts for the production of a certain misogyny deeply associated with capitalism, with modernity, and with the modern itself. So I would proceed by expanding the notes. Then I would go back to the questions, sort through the questions, generate new questions, start to answer them. In starting to answer the questions after sorting through them and having rewatched the films, I would identify something that seems like it would work as a thesis, start outlining the paper, and writing it. This isn't what you have to do at all. It's just I thought it would be helpful to show that there are, in fact, a series of steps that I more or less always follow, and that's how it gets done. It involves, so I've tried to strip away as much of the mystification of the paper writing process as I can. The one thing that remains mystified is that this takes a lot of time, and you're in a lot of classes, but I think you can understand how to maybe make it slightly more manageable. So I just wanted to give you that. Sorry for the many typos. I'll try and go back. All right, so unfortunately we're out of time for questions. Is there anything really, this is fairly clear? All right, so I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Bye. Just so